Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's SCLF webinar. My name is Alison Mackay, I'm a member of the SCLF Executive Committee, and I'm delighted today to have Steve Wilson joining us to give the webinar. So just before we start, we'll just do a few housekeeping things. You will have noticed that we have switched to the webinar platform instead of the meeting platform. So that means that you are unable to share your camera or unmute yourself. If during the Q&A you have a burning question you would like to ask in question, if you just put your hand up and we will try to come to you. There is a dedicated question and answer box, so you can put your questions to Steve in there. If we don't get through all the questions today, then we will have another opportunity during our next webinar, which is on the 10th of June, which is our regulatory and practitioner perspectives panel session. If you have signed up for that already on Eventbrite, can I ask you to look at your mailbox, because you'll have an email in there this morning inviting you to go and do the pre-registration on GoToWebinar. If you haven't yet signed up, then just head to our website under the events page and click on the register button. It will take you straight to the GoToWebinar platform to register. Just a note to say that today's session is being recorded, and shortly after today's session it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and I'll put a link to that if you don't know about where that is in the chat in a wee while. Also, if you are wanting the slides from today, once I've managed to get them PDF'd and on the website, then they should be available on the website in the past webinars section. I would ask you as well, when you log out of this webinar today, you will be asked to complete a short survey. I would ask you if you could do that. In particular, I would like to know about any future ideas for webinars, but also about how you have found joining today's webinar. And I know that there has been a bit of a sort of duplication of registration this time round, but going forward, then that should be smoothed out, and it'll actually be more simple than the Eventbrite registration. So without further ado, and just, well, in fact, before I introduce Steve, I'm just going to open a wee poll. Now, bear with me, because I haven't used this platform before, so I need to select the poll first. Hold on. Okay, so I'm launching a poll, and if you can maybe, I'm not sure if people can see that. Yep, okay, so people are putting responses in the poll. So if you can maybe just answer that wee poll question, we'll come back to that in a wee minute. And in the meantime, I'll just introduce Steve. Steve probably doesn't really need much of an introduction. He's well known as a gas risk assessor. He is chartered engineer and a SoBRA accredited risk assessor who's been pleading with people for over 20 years, which is a long time, Steve, to consider the CSM in gas risk assessment. He regularly undertakes gas risk assessments that demonstrate gas protection is not required on low risk sites, even though gas concentrations in monitoring wells are elevated. So I am very happy to have him with us today. I'm just going to make you a presenter, Steve, so that you can share your screen. And that's just the poll at the moment. So I think I'll just close the poll because we've got 94%. So I'll close that and share that with you. So there you go. That's the results of the poll there. Can you see them, Steve? Yeah.
No.
You might not be able to. So I'm going to have to tell you what they are then. So we've got 4% for the NHBC guidance, and then we've got 39% for the Syria, and 56% with the British Standard. So
that's good. Right, excellent. No, that's good. So the reason for that question really is because what I want to do is explain one of the key differences between the Syria guidance and the British Standard, which I'll come to in a moment. Can you see my screen, Alison?
Not yet, not yet.
Right, okay. It says it's showing it.
Hold on a minute, just double check.
Right, wait a minute.
Oh, that's you now.
Yeah, you can see that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Right, okay. So, yeah, thank you, Alison, and the committee at Scottish Contaminated Land Forum for inviting me to present at this workshop today. So what I'm going to look at is following on from what Matt did last week in terms of looking at the multiple lines of evidence approach. Really, I mean that broad term covers this whole process that we should be following when we're doing gas risk assessment. And what Matt was saying last week is that a lot of people are just calculating a GSV from the maximum flow rate and the maximum concentration, and hopefully you'll see at the end of today why that's not the correct approach. So first of all, I will be talking about the ground engineering paper that Geoff Card, James Lucas and myself wrote a couple of years ago. But really what we need to understand first of all is the approach that is provided in BS 8485 in the 2015 version in terms of deriving GSVs, because the ground engineering paper does back reference to that process that is described in BS 8485, which is effectively a multiple lines of evidence approach in reality, although it doesn't say that in sort of explicit terms. So really, using flow rates in gas risk assessment started in 1999 when Geoff and myself wrote the original paper in ground engineering, and we published the first GSVs, although I don't think they were called that in the paper. I think they were called hazardous gas borehole flow rates, or some very lengthy description. But in that paper, effectively the GSVs, they are predominantly empirically based values based on past performance by looking at what gas monitoring results we'd found in monitoring wells on sites, and looking at the types of protection that people had put in on those sites, combined with some monitoring in underflow venting systems in particular. And in that first paper, that was a radical step change from what we were doing at the time, because everything prior to that was really based on gas concentrations. And as a result of that, it had a requirement in there that you must increase from CS1 to CS2 if you had more than 1% methane or more than 5% carbon dioxide. And that's because where we were as an industry in terms of understanding of ground gas risk. Come around to 2007 and we had Syria C65, and the major change there was that it says consider an increase from CS1 to CS2 if there's greater than 1% methane or 5% carbon dioxide. And what we'd realised in the intervening years, we'd started to understand ground gas risk better. And we were starting to realise that on lots of sites where there wasn't any ground gas risk, if you put monitoring wells in the ground, you can find slightly elevated concentrations of methane and carbon dioxide. For example, if you put wells in the Rivers Terrace gravel around London, you can find up to 21% carbon dioxide, but it's not pouring out of the ground at a rate that will pose a risk. And the same with glacial till, in particular, up in the northwest of England. So that was the first sort of change from the original Wilson and Card paper. And then in 2015, when BS 8485 was published, the process changed for deriving the GSV. So cursory reading of C665 would lead you to believe that you just choose the maximum gas concentration, the maximum flow rate, multiply those two together, and that gives you the GSV. Yeah, but if you read all the text in Syria C65, there are certain sort of paragraphs that would actually drive you towards looking at the CSM and not necessarily using maximum values, and the table, notes to tables and things like that. But in BS 8485, there is a step change, and it gives a process for the deriving a GSV, and the definition of the GSV has changed from that is provided in C665. And what it said, I mean, the final sentence in the definition in one of the notes is that ultimately the GSV is based on judgment. And what that means is it can't be calculated in inverted commas. And I'll explain the process in a bit more detail in the next couple of slides. So that process is relied upon in the 2019 paper that we published in Ground Engineering, Risk and Reliability in Gas Protection Design, 20 years on. So what we've done there, we've provided new GSVs. We now call the sort of the new characteristic situations in inverted commas are actually called gas regimes. And that was in response to a very good comment actually by one of the peer reviewers who said you need to call it something different to avoid confusion. So we, instead of calling it CS1 to CS6, you've now got gas regime A to D to make sure that there is that confusion is removed. And we started, I can't remember whose name it was now, so apologies, but a presentation a couple of months ago sort of explained that we're starting to move towards a more analytical approach to derive the GSVs. But that's what we should be doing. That's what we do in vapour intrusion. It's what we're doing in other fields in contaminated land. So that's really what we should be trying to do with ground gas as well. And then one of the sort of other key factors that limiting values for gas regime A, which is the regime when you don't need any gas protection, are 30% methane and 21% carbon dioxide. And I'll explain why that is the case in a few slides' time. So yeah, see, whenever I do a presentation, everybody knows that I get on the old box and talk about CSMs. Please, 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 when you are doing gas risk assessments, to be honest, whichever method you are using, do not take the maximum concentration, maximum flow rate, and multiply them together to get a GSV without any thought of the CSM, or equally as important, without any check on data quality. So this is my colleagues and myself on a regular basis when we were asked to review gas risk assessment reports. And the number one is, why have they used data from flooded wells that is completely unrepresentative of what the CSM is telling you? And equally, the other one we see an awful lot is there's, people stick 20-metre deep ground monitoring wells into rock, into flooded sand layers in glacial till, all sorts of things, and then you use the ridiculously high flow rates that they get from those wells to calculate a GSV. So please don't do that. And on a, this is an extreme example. Well, unfortunately, it probably isn't an extreme example. We see equally sort of bad practice on a regular basis. So you can see here why somebody stuck a monitoring well in the top of a stockpile that was clearly going to be removed from site when it was developed is beyond me. Why they then monitored it and used the data to classify the whole site is also beyond me. But that is what has happened. They classified it as CS2 on the basis of that data, when all the other monitoring wells in that site that were actually in the glacial till, which covered the site that was going to be developed, was telling you it was CS1, and the conceptual model was telling you it was going to be CS1. An extreme example, and they were costing their client a lot of money on that job. But unfortunately, the people who can do that can also do things like this that is unsafe. Yeah, they don't actually recognise when there is a real gas risk. Yeah, so on this one, there's shallow coal workings underneath the site. The monitoring wells are in the shallow made ground, and that tells you that it's got a low flow rate. But there are indicators there, particularly the low oxygen concentration, that there might be an issue with mine gas emissions. Low oxygen concentrations on its own is not a good indicator of risk, but when you look at the CSM, it does give you a warning sign. And then when you look at the CSM, you can see that there are unflooded shallow mine workings. There's fluctuating groundwater over the depth where those workings are present. There are numerous shafts on site present, and regardless of what the gas monitoring data in that shallow made ground says, you should be looking at what is happening in that deeper stratum. And whether the made ground is going to actually provide a buffer, for example. It needs a much more rigorous assessment And to be honest, I would, it's unlikely that you're going to classify that site as CS1 based on what you can see there. So these things about not looking at CSMs work both ways. The majority of times it does cost clients hundreds of thousands of pounds, but equally it can result in unsafe assessments as well. So the process in BS 8485 is explained in clause 3.4 of BS 8485. The definition of a GSV is provided in 3.4. So it's the flow rate of hazardous gas representative of a site or zone derived from assessment of borehole concentrations and flow measurements, taking account of all other influencing factors in accordance with the CSM. And it says there that note this definition is different from the definition of a GSV in Syria C65. And you can see there that's the statement about ultimately derived using professional judgment. So how do we go about doing that? Well, the first thing to do is to collect the desk study information. That shouldn't just be commercial databases. You should actually be doing a wider search. The first thing we ever do is actually Google the site name and site address and various things like that to see if there's any things come up from local history sites, for example, on the internet. Then prepare a preliminary conceptual site model, and that should include site-specific cross-sections showing the ground profile and potential sources, migration pathways, etc. And then you do the preliminary risk assessment. And what you've got to do there, I'm forever using this word credible and realistic sources of ground gas because people come out with the weirdest and wonderful statements about what can cause gas migration onto sites or sources of gas on sites. And I'll explain a few of those again in a couple of slides' time. But you've got to avoid generic statements. If a landfill poses a risk of migration to your site, justify that position based on the site-specific data. And if it's 250 metres away and it's got to migrate through 250 metres of London clay, it's not really going to pose a risk of migration to the site. Then design the site investigation. We always collect TOC data if we're specifying site investigations for gas, if we're in the source, because it helps you, it gives you a much better understanding of what the gas risk is and helps you interpret the data. Carry out the site investigation, and you've got to design the response zones. Now, when we're looking at ground gas risk, we should be doing what we're doing in vapor intrusion. In vapor intrusion world, you're monitoring vapor in the unsaturated zone, and that's what we're interested in when we're doing ground gas risk assessment. So we don't really want to be monitoring from deep wells that are either flooded or extend into the below the groundwater as far as possible, and it's not always possible on sites. Sometimes you think you've got them in the unsaturated zone and then water gets into them, but it should be the aim when you set out. And what that means is that you've got to adjust the response zones based on what you see when you're drilling. You can't just say, right, we're going to stick monitoring pipes in from 1 metre to 4 metres and then just leave it at that and let the drillers do that. This needs good supervision on site to get those installations in properly. And I think Matt said last week, we should see these as instruments, as part of the instrumentation, not just something that we shove in the ground willy-nilly. We then refine the CSM, and crucially, it doesn't call it a data quality assessment, but in clause 6.3.1 in the second bullet, you've got to consider whether the data is representative. So look at whether you've got excessive flow rates from flooded wells that aren't representative. Look at whether the wells are flooded and causing excessive gas concentrations that aren't representative, or they're flooded and not allowing gas in that's coming through an off-site migration pathway. Is that flooding then representative of what's happening in the pathway? You've really got to look at the data and how it's being collected and decide whether it's acceptable or not. An example of one that Sarah Mortimer, a colleague of mine, saw a couple of weeks ago. There was I can't remember whether it was a gas concentration or a flow rate, but it stood out as being completely different to what had been monitored on numerous occasions before and after. And when we looked at it and looked at the actual sheets, it turned out that somebody different had done the monitoring on that one occasion. And we don't know what they did, but it was clear that it wasn't, there was some operator influence that potentially had caused that difference in result. It talks in clause 6.3.4 about using steady state flow rates. We find quite frequently that people state a steady state flow rate, and when you look, they've only monitored for a minute or 3 minutes. If you've got peak flow rates, high peak flow rates, it can quite often take at least 10 minutes for it to drop down to a truly steady state. So you really need to be sure that what you are quoting is a steady state. And then you calculate the hazardous gas flow rate for each borehole for each monitoring event, which is in clause 6.3.1, the first bullet, and it also says that in figure 3. Consider the temporal or spatial shortage in data, which you need to go back to the CSM to see whether there is a high risk source or a low risk source or whatever. And then you use judgment. You look at what's happening. You don't just take the peak value. So normally what we would expect to see is that people plot those individual results against time, so that you can see if there is just one peak and what caused that peak. Have you got sufficient data to say that that is an isolated thing? What's the time frame between readings, etc., to allow you to make that judgment. And you also need to do that. You need to separate that out as well into different strata, because a high peak, high flow rate from a deeper strata, if that's not replicated in shallower strata, then you've then got to make a judgment on whether it's whether it's justifiable to use it as the GSV for the site. There are then other considerations in BS 8485, so you need to read the whole of the thing, not just the tables. So you need to look at gas concentrations, as we've said, worst case assessment, and is it credible and reasonable. So there is the requirement to consider the increase. It's not mandatory. We read so many times people saying you've got to increase from CS1 to CS2 because there's 6% carbon dioxide. That is not correct. It says consider, and you've got to justify whether it is, whether you do need to increase it. And if, again, as I said, if you're on a site where all you've got is terrace gravels, there's no made ground or limited made ground, no real source, then just because you've got 7 or 8% carbon dioxide, even 16, 17% carbon dioxide, that happens because of natural processes in the ground. Yeah, we understand that far better now. And you shouldn't really be increasing to CS2 on that basis. Ternary plots are a good way of understanding what the source is. And there's a paper that we sort of published. It's not an official. It's not a peer. Well, it is peer reviewed. We always, anything we put in the public domain, we get peer reviewed by people in the industry. But it's not in an official journal. It's part of the update we're doing for the ground gas handbook. So that's on our website as a ground gas information sheet. But that is useful. You then consider alterations to the pathway or to the source as part of the construction. So, for example, is basement construction going to remove the source? Are piles going to form a preferential pathway from a deeper gas source up to the surface? If you're using stone columns, they're the one that we get really nervous about. They may provide a pathway. It is best to avoid them if you can. If you are going to put them in, then you need to do a rigorous assessment of whether they're going to increase the risk above what you're classifying the site as originally. And other things, there's a job I've looked at recently where people were putting prefabricated vertical drains into alluvium to help with the consolidation. So basically they're just like an open conduit again for gas to come up to the surface. So we had to do quite a rigorous analysis on that to see whether that's going to affect the gas risk or not. Clause 6.3.2 does contradict virtually every other sort of statement in BS 8485, where it says GSV is the maximum hazardous gas flow rate, but it's only use the maximum if it's reasonable to do so. And in clause 7.7.3.4, it says if there's a limited data set, assess the GSV using the reasonable worst case measurements, but in the same stratum. Yeah, and also don't do it using data from flooded wells or other poor quality data. So yeah, discount peak instantaneous flows if they drop off and they're clearly caused by flooding. And then it does say to adopt the worst case as a GSV, the assessor should be confident that it is prudent and reasonable and does not result in unnecessarily conservative protection of the development. So you have to think about this fundamentally. It's not just let's barge in there, look at the gas monitoring data, choose the two biggest numbers and say that is okay. You've actually got to provide judgment. And you really got to be thinking, we do this all the time. When we're doing these assessments, it's like if somebody reviews this, will they be convinced by our arguments? And that's what you got to be thinking about. And then finally, consider extreme events and future changes, which is clause 4, note 3. And there's a bit more guidance about sort of looking at future changes in Syria report C795 on retrofitting, and also in the Clare guidance on mine gas risk assessment that is going to be published soon. It's not being published because I've not got my act in together to do the final edits and organise everybody to have a meeting about it, but it will be around pretty soon. And again, there, don't invent hypothetical consequences. It's got to be realistic and credible. So the CSM should be site-specific diagram, not generic, and the reason for that is explained here. This is a generic CSM that we were provided with. It's not based on actual, the true cross-section of what is going to happen on that site. And it suggests that the whole building is going to be underlain by made ground that's producing gas. If you actually look at what is really happening on that site, you can see there that first of all, made ground is only present in part of the site, and secondly, it's virtually all going to be removed by the construction of the building. So no risk at all of gas ingress into that building. So top 5 errors: calculated GSV from maximum concentration and flow rate, regardless of CSM and response zones. No data quality because you're using peak flow rates from flooded wells. Increasing from CS1 to CS2 on basis of elevated concentrations when there's no credible source and not taking account of the CSN. Not taking account of foundation construction and the effect of gas risk. So what we've said in the coal mine report or guidance is actually the gas risk assessment shouldn't be signed off and finalised until the foundation design and floor slab construction is finalised. And at that point, you should do a review to make sure that the final sort of construction proposals won't influence the gas risk. And really, although it's in that mining report, it actually applies to all ground gas risk assessment. And then the fifth sort of thing that causes issues is response zones in monitoring wells that span strata. So it makes it difficult to interpret the data. And then coming back to credible sources, things that we've read, a pond was present 50 metres away, infilled in the 1920s. Yeah, most small ponds are not particularly deep. The kind of things that you used to see on maps in fields at field boundaries, those natural ponds aren't deep. Yeah, and it is very unlikely that if it was filled in it's nigh on impossible if it was filled in the 20s for lateral migration to occur out of those features. Yeah, so be realistic. Yeah, good one I saw here is that earthworks for the roads in the adjacent housing site could cause lateral gas migration, unless you've got very strong evidence that they've built the road embankments out of domestic waste. I'd suggest that that's not very likely either. Lateral migration from alluvium, it's just not going to happen. There isn't sufficient gas generation and gas reservoir for it to cause significant lateral migration through the ground. And driven piles will increase the characteristic situation. Again, on the majority of sites, that's not true. Piles of any description can cause preferential pathways, but in very, very specific circumstances. Really, it's where you've got either open tube piles that aren't infilled, or if you've got a gas source that is pressurized and it's got a very thin confining layer over the top of it. But all that is explained in a paper that Sarah and myself wrote a couple of years ago that's in Environmental Geotechnics. So don't mix data from different response zones. This is just a diagrammatic explanation of that. And to be fair, on this site, the consultant did a good job with this one. They recognised that the flow rates that they were getting out of these deeper wells, whether they were flooded or unflooded, were actually not representative of the ground gas risk at the surface. It's just because it had gone into fractured rock. And when the assessment was done using the flow rates and carbon dioxide concentrations just in the made ground, that lowered the classification of the site significantly, as you'd expect, because you can see there's 82.1 litres per hour. Even the steady state values are something, well, assuming they were steady state, were about 33 litres per hour. But there wasn't any, the made ground was a slight source, but nothing that could support those sorts of gas emission rates in the long term. But yeah, the assessment was based on a thorough sort of understanding of the CSM on that site. So the ground engineering paper, where does it fit? So in actual fact, some parts of the paper can be used with spot monitoring and the current GSVs, because there's a lot of background information in there about gas in alluvium, natural sources of carbon dioxide, presence of gas in engineered fill and American, research that's been done in America. But to use the new screening values, you do have to have continuous monitoring. So there's a trade-off. If you want to be less conservative in the assessment, you need better quality data. So one of the requirements for those screening levels is using continuous monitoring data. And I think really I was thinking about this when I was doing this presentation. Where do they sit in the current approach? And they probably sit, because the current gas screening values, they do, if you apply them properly, they do work, but they are empirical. And I think with these are still screening values that we've published, but as we said, they're based on an analytical approach. So they probably sit somewhere between the empirical approach and DQRA, detailed quantitative assessment. But that's just me trying to think where would you sit them in that process. So methane in alluvium, we are forever doing literature searches to check for gas emission incidents. And over the past sort of 15, 20 years, I've never seen any instance of methane migration from surface buildings into surface buildings from alluvium. And there are reasons why that is the case. For one thing, geological peat and organic material in alluvium does not generate gas at sufficient rates to actually, cause hazardous gas emissions. If there are emissions, it will be at extremely low rates that are almost imperceptible. And that's because the organic material that is left is non-labile. It's not degradable. And also, peat and alluvium are typically saturated in geological deposits, which first of all, it limits diffusion rates and it limits free gas volume as well. Now, you can get pockets of trapped gas, small pockets of trapped gas in alluvium. And even some people think they've got large pockets, but in the scheme of things, they're small. The reason they're trapped is because it's low permeability. And that shows that actually it's trapped, it's not moving. And you might puncture it with a pile and you get a short-term emission. but it's not going to pose a significant hazard to buildings up above. And also you get surface tension forces which sort of limit movement as well. But what you do get in a lot of cases is dissolved phase gas in pore water, and that influences the results. And also peat is the first step of coalification in effect. And we all know that there is, coal has a lot of adsorbed methane in it, which is why it causes such problems in mines. And that also applies to peat as well. So you've got a lot of methane adsorbed onto the organic material that's only released when you actually drill a monitoring well into it. Normally it's just sat there happily not doing anything. And then research in America has found that made ground in uncontrolled and engineered fill materials, you can find methane greater than 1%, especially if you've got wet zones in it and there's an anaerobic zone. And that can occur locally as well. You don't have to have a continuous groundwater table. You can have these localized perch tables that you get, and you have these anaerobic hotspots that are producing methane, but not at volumes that pose a risk. So again, concentrations are not a good indicator of risk in these situations. And what they also found is that the probability of detecting methane increases with the increase in depth of well, which is probably pretty obvious to most people. But you do have to think where you've got deep fill projects, are you going to put wells in to great depth, or are you just sort of going to put wells in at 4 meters, shallow over the 4 meter, 5 meter depth to see what's happening up at the top, because that's what you're interested in terms of emissions. If you put really deep wells in, you increase the risk of finding elevated concentrations that aren't really representative of the risk to the development. And an extensive study in a project in America found that high concentrations of methane, up to 30%, are normal in engineered fills, particularly those containing silts and clays. And they've proposed 30% methane as a rule of thumb to identify when gas production may pose a risk of significant emissions. And that's what we've adopted in the paper. Carbon dioxide's everywhere in the subsoil environment. As I've said, in coal measures, river terrace gravels, in inert made ground, you find elevated carbon dioxide, and it's being produced not by methanogenic degradation that you get in landfills. It's biological respiration, which is a different process, and it occurs extremely slowly, so it can't produce high flows of gas from the ground. You have to be careful with colliery spoil. If you're building above colliery spoil and you're pretty confident there's not going to be any changes to groundwater chemistry, it's low risk, and it's not going to cause hazardous emissions. You do have to be careful if you're putting basements into it, and also if you're grouting up mine workings, and quite often the colliery spoil is in sort of backfilled open cast pits, and you've got mine workings leading into it. And if you upset the sort of groundwater chemistry and you get acidic groundwater coming into the colliery spoil, it can produce large volumes of carbon dioxide and pose an issue. So on to the approach for the final part of this presentation. So this is the CSM for the new approach. And again, if we're going to go to a more analytical approach, then you need to check that the assumptions made in deriving these screening values fit your site. And that is the same as you would do if you were doing a risk assessment and using the GACs, the S4 ULs and all the other ones that are around, or the groundwater values that SoBRA have published. You should be looking at the derivation of those values to make sure that what you're doing on your site fits the model that they've used to derive those values, and that's the same for these ground gas values. So we've effectively looked at flow towards radial flow towards a borehole, and we've looked at what the limiting flow rate from the well would need to be to limit gas migration into the building to an acceptable level. So it's a standard analysis. It's just using Fick's law and Darcy's law, and radial flow to a well, and it's relatively straightforward. Now, what you do need, you need a flow boundary. So you need a fully penetrating well to a flow boundary. In groundwater analysis, that would have to be an impermeable boundary such as clay, but for gas, groundwater will provide an impermeable flow boundary. And we're assuming that the gas source is at 1 metre depth, which, to be honest, on most sites, that is what, we've yet to see a site where that is not the case, mainly because you will get oxygenation of the soil airspace up to 1 metre on most sites. And even if you put a building on top of it, if it's housing, for example, that's not going to cap it off enough that you don't get that same oxygenation under the centre of the building. You do have to be a bit careful with warehouses and larger span buildings, because that might not be the case. It's also got important limitations, and to be honest, these probably should be applied to BS 8485 as well. So it's not to be applied where the gas source is an actively gassing landfill site, but be realistic about this. So, for example, a 1960s landfill, it would be suitable to use it for, but not for the more recent sort of domestic sites. Don't use it where gas could be migrating from open mine workings via shafts or fractured rock. So you need to check the CSM to make sure that you can use it. So you can use it where you've got coal measures. And if you've got unworked coal seams, that's not a problem. But where you've got these potentially high-risk sources of open mine workings and shafts, you shouldn't use it. And where gas is from volcanic emissions, but I doubt that many people will be worrying about that. But there are countries where, where we have done work where we've got volcanic emissions. I suppose the other thing that I would say is don't use it where you've got sort of leaking oil and gas wells, which is potentially going to be an issue, where you've got fracking sites and things like that. It's certainly an issue in California, for example, where they've got lots of leaking oil wells that cause gas emissions that have caused explosions in buildings. So it's for all these sites that we normally dealing with, alluvium, general fill, made ground, and old or inert landfill sites. And there's also a requirement that it's only to be applied by qualified and experienced risk assessment professionals. So think about that when you're starting to use it. So if we are modelling, we need to limit the gas hazard values indoors. So essentially what we've done is for gas regime A, which is where there's no gas protection required, we're assuming that there's no floor slab or any form of floor construction. Effectively, we're assuming you've got an open earth floor. And for that, we've used 100 ppm for methane, 0.04%, which is 400 ppm for carbon dioxide, and 20.5% for oxygen. Now, the carbon dioxide, actually, we could have used 1,000 ppm, but we erred on the side of caution for that one. But those values and the background to them are explained in Syria report C795, which is retrofitting gas protection measures again. Then as we go up the gas regime, we've increased the allowable concentrations inside the building, but that is because you're going to end up putting gas protection in the buildings. So to avoid having to make it specific to a specific type of construction, the way we've managed that is to allow the gas ingress inside to build up, because otherwise you would have to use the 100 ppm, for example, for methane, and you'd have to do a detailed analysis of how the gas is getting into the building through the building construction, which would then stop them being generic values. So that's the way we've managed that, and why you've got those different values for the different gas regimes. So this is the table. Again, I'm not going to dwell on this, but please read the notes to this table. Yeah, don't just sort of charge in here and use the numbers without really thinking about it. But so key differences to what we've got already are, as I said, we've called it gas regime A, B, C and D to distinguish between gas regimes. We've also narrowed it down, yeah, because what we found in practice is that there's not a lot of difference between some of the gas regimes. So for example, once you get up to 5 or 6, yeah, it's probably, in practical terms, there's probably no difference between those two. And to be honest, for housing, there's no real practical difference between CS2 and CS3. I would, certainly what we find. It's also, because we've got an analytical approach, you've got to look at the permeability of the soils. So for methane and carbon dioxide, we've got different values for different permeabilities. Depending on your confidence of those permeabilities will depend on which of these you use. You might just stump for the lowest values if you've not got good confidence. And we've included oxygen deficient gas as well. Now you can see there the number there, the gas screening value 217 litres per hour for nitrogen is quite high. And the reason for that is that you do need high flow rates to actually displace oxygen out of an occupied space to an extent that it's going to actually pose a hazard. Which, when you think about it, makes sense, because the only time where it's been known to cause problems is in places where you're getting very, very high flow rates, i.e. a building built over the top of a mine shaft, where it's coming into tunnels and it's flowing into tunnels very quickly and things like that. And then we've also tried to simplify the protection required as well. So we've moved away from the scoring system, because what we're seeing is lots of people who really, don't understand gas risk in particular, sort of just thinking that gas design is adding up a few points. So we've moved away from that, and we've said it's got to be, the scoring system is just based on levels of protection. So levels of redundancy is a better description. And we've narrowed down the types of development as well. Because I think people focus on the wrong things when they're looking at these type A and type B, for example. So we've simplified that down. And you can see really, you've got gas regime A, none is required for residential development. Gas regime B, you need 2 levels of protection. Same for C. And then anything above that, you go to do a site-specific assessment. And really, the levels of protection are the same, but the design of those is going to change between the 2 gas regimes. And really, that's going to revolve around the robustness of the floor slab construction and the design of any underfloor venting that you put into the system. But we're sort of shifting away from sort of just adding up points to actually doing more analytical design as well is required for this approach. And then that's just a comparison to finish off with the existing BS8485 system on the left, and you can see for the methane and the carbon dioxide. So we are moving the numbers upwards without a doubt, but certainly from the work that we've done in the past, past 10, 15 years, this is still conservative. It's still precautionary. It's still on the right side of the fence, but they are, these numbers are far better in terms of not sort of putting in unnecessary gas protection measures when we don't need to. And you can see the for carbon dioxide, the numbers they are, well, I said they're significantly higher. Yeah, 7 litres per hour, to be honest, in reality, is still extremely low when you compare that to the kind of flow rates that you get out of the high-risk sources that we know cause problems. Yeah, so for example, mine shafts, you can easily get 3,000 or 4,000 litres per hour coming out of mine shafts. You can easily get sort of 10,000 litres per hour coming out of landfill sites. So we're still at very, very low rates, even with these numbers. And then just finally, an example where we've used it on a site. So we've put response zones in the unsaturated zone. The flow boundary is the groundwater On this site, there's a clean layer of fill that's roughly about 1 metre deep, and then the main material that's causing elevated gas is below that. We've got fully penetrating wells. We've got gas monitoring using continuous monitoring data, covers sufficient pressure drops in Clare TB16. We know what the permeability of ground is because that's been estimated. I'm not sure whether we measured it on this one, but we'd got sort of good descriptions of the soil, and we've made a conservative assessment. And the migration pathways in soil, it's not in rock, and there are no preferential pathways that are going to be a concern. So it meets all the requirements. And then you can see here, actually, the bottom graph, the hazardous gas flow rates from the continuous monitoring, are all actually well below the limiting value for gas regime A. And this is really why this one was a good test, and others have been, because what we want to know is if we're getting these low flow rates and we think it needs gas protection, are these other fail-safes kicking in to kick us up into gas regime B? And on this site they are. So you can see here in these we had peaks of gas concentration above 30% in that one well, but then another well we had these peaks that were going up to 60%, but we were regularly getting close to or slightly exceeding 30%. And that ties in with a conceptual model of the material that was producing the gas, which is fairly old waste. It's not the kind of site where you wouldn't put gas protection measures in, but there's not an excessive risk. And then the same applied with the borehole pressures as well. So another limiting factor is the pressure's got to be less than 500 pascals. So again, the maximum borehole pressure was frequently either coming up towards 500 and exceeding it. So that then pushes us into gas regime B, and 2 levels of protection were required, which on this site is a gas membrane and venting, which is what we would have arrived at using BS 8485 in actual fact. So the fail safes are there to make sure that we do put gas protection measures in where it is required. And then finally, just use it as part of a multiple lines of evidence approach, and that's explained in Syria C795 there. So you do need to actually go through each line of evidence, look at it, assess it, and then you say, right, this line of evidence is saying this site is low risk, or it's saying it's higher risk, or whatever. And you do that for each line of evidence, and then at the bottom of that, so right, overall, everything is saying low risk, everything's fine, or everything's saying high risk, it's high risk, or this bit of we've got this one bit of evidence that doesn't fit in with everything else, so therefore we think it's, you know, whatever risk. So you've got to make that judgment. You don't, in a multiple lines of evidence approach, you don't just rely on the gas monitoring data. And that's just some of these ground gas information sheets that we're producing as we work on updating the ground gas handbook. So thank you, and hopefully we have got time for a few questions.
That's great, Steve. Thank you very much. Yeah, we do have some questions coming in. Can you hear me, Steve? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's nice. Sorry. Yeah, so maybe just invite Stephen to come on as well, and we can do sort of like a question about for you. So Patrick Flood was in very, very quick, like at 12 o'clock. He had a very early question into the Mighty Wilson. He's asked CS2 stroke Amber 1 site classification. Why does industry still do this? I sense some frustration in there.
To be fair, he did pre-warn me about this question because he rang me up earlier and said, do you mind if I ask this question? Yeah, we do see it all the time. And hopefully what you can see from that, I didn't mention the NHBC guidance in that first slide, but I suppose the NHBC guidance was an attempt to move towards a more analytical approach, because it does look at gas emissions into avoiding the dilution. I think one of the problems with it not being sort of more widely taken up is that because they've relied on the building construction to inform the actual derivation of the screening values, it makes it quite specific, and that's what we've tried to avoid with this approach. But fundamentally, you've got different approach to deriving the values and different requirements for protection. So you cannot mix and match the different approaches. You've got to assess it using NHBC, and so this is what is required, or I'm assessing it using 665 and this is what is required, or I'm using BS 8485. So you can't take a GSV using max, if you follow the, as I said, a cursory reading of C665 gives you multiply the maximum flow rate and concentration. You then have to use the tables for the protection in C665. You can't jump to the point system, for example. So yeah, we do see it, and you can't do that. Yeah.
Right, can I maybe ask Stephen to ask the next question because my dog's going crazy?
Yeah, sure. So someone's just asked about when your wells are continuously flooded during monitoring events, what would you say are the best next steps, basically, to get accurate monitoring results, or to understand the gas regime on site, I guess?
Well, it depends whether you can actually, if you've installed them with the response zones too deep. So one of the common issues is that people will put the response zones down, so they'll have a 3 or 4 meter solid section of pipe and then the response zone. So the question is, can you actually install the wells into the unsaturated zone? Is that feasible? There are sites that we see where you've got alluvium in particular, where you've got groundwater up at 0.5 meters or less, approaching ground surface, and you just can't put monitoring wells in. And that tells you that, gas monitoring in that situation is not going to give you a sensible answer to what the risk is on that site. And then you have to look at other methods. So maybe using flux chambers and surface emissions measurements, for example, could be a better approach than using monitoring wells on those sites.
Brilliant. Another question is just regarding negative flow rates being used in PS 8584 and yes 667 665. Basically, this person's had the CLO coming back chatting about the need for considering using the negative flows as the hypothetical maximum rate, and this person just isn't convinced about that. So it'd be nice if you could set them straight.
Well, every single answer usually is look at the CSN. You've got to understand why those negative flow rates are occurring. And a lot of the time, you see the negative flow rates occurring, and it's actually telling you that there's no underlying driving pressure from gas in the ground. Because if you do put wells into landfill sites in particular, where you've got gas generation, normally the overriding flow, because of the gas in the ground, stops those flow rates going negative. You still see responses to atmospheric pressure, but the responses don't go negative. So it can be an indicator that there is no underlying driving pressure for the gas. But equally, you've got to fully understand why it's happening. And if you don't understand what the processes are, there is an argument that whatever is causing it to flow out could reverse, or whatever is causing it to flow in could reverse and cause it to flow out. There's no easy answer to that one really, but apart from look at the conceptual site model. Don't just, if you're purely looking at gas data, that's when it tends to cause people problems. Yeah, it's because they're not approaching the gas at risk assessment using the CSN.
I'll ask the next one then. Someone's asked, should we be considering officially withdrawing the Syria guidance given the advances in analytical measures that you've discussed?
No, because one thing I would say is that, yeah, okay, that approach, the screening method that is in there using GSVs has advanced, but there is an awful lot of technical background information in that report that is still valid. So it certainly shouldn't be withdrawn. And to be honest, it's guidance. Yeah, it's up to people to choose which guidance they use. Even a British standard is only guidance. Yeah, it is not mandatory to use a British standard. Although if you didn't follow it and something went wrong, you would have to justify why you hadn't followed it. But equally, you know, if something goes wrong and you followed a British standard and you've not followed it correctly, then you could equally sort of be in trouble, or you've applied it in a way which it wasn't intended and not thought about the actual site. Then again, just tick boxing I followed BS 8485 is not going to cover you if if something does go wrong. So I don't think it should be withdrawn. I think the other side of that coin is that every single professional body that offers chartership or SoBRA with a gas assessor course has a requirement that you keep up to date with CPD. Yeah, so anybody who is doing gas risk assessment should be fully aware of the fact that BS 8485 is around, and that's really the approach that they should be adopting.
I think we'll just squeeze in one final question. There are still quite a few in the chat, but some I think would be absolutely ideal for our panel in a couple of weeks' time. So if we just maybe finish on this, is the new regime only applicable with robust data sets and good confidence in the limits of the CSM? This was from Patrick, and he says he basically his concern is that people adopting the new approach without understanding the level of data confidence required to use it.
Yeah, and he's right, and it's always a danger. But if we don't publish these things, we're not going to move any further forward. But it is, you know, we've put those caveats in there for exactly that reason, that you've got to have that data confidence, and that's why we've, you know, I think most people know I'm a director of Ambisense. We've developed this because we've got lots and lots of continuous monitoring data now, and if we're collecting that data, we need to make better use of it than just sort of taking the maximum values and multiplying them together. But that's why we've got the caveat in there about it's got to be professional, qualified people that use this. But you will never ever get away from people misusing what you publish. I've learned that, you know, over 20 years of publishing stuff. But hopefully the regulators will realise that. I mean, I think regulators should start asking serious questions about the competence of some of the people that write reports that we see. We need to do something about it, without a doubt.
Well, I think that brings us absolutely brilliantly to the end of our session, Steve. So thank you very much. And if you haven't yet signed up for our panel session on the 10th of June, then just head to our website and you'll be able to click straight through and sign up on GoToWebinar. So thank you everybody for. Oh, sorry. When you go.
Sorry, can I just add one last? If there were questions that people asked and they've not answered them, my email stuck up there on the screen. If they send the question by email, I'll try and answer it for them. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt.
That's brilliant. And I'll get a chat log as well of all the questions, so I can send them to you as well, Steve. So that's brilliant. Okay, so so we'll leave it there for today. Thank you everybody for coming, and we'll see you on the 10th of June. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.